Gary and Annie have been married for 10 years and they have a son named Harry, who is now 8. Gary is a construction engineer at a large company in Portland. His job requires a lot of concentration and often requires him to travel far from home to oversee large projects. He often comes home late in the evenings and his weekends are often filled with work. She works as a freelance interior designer in Portland, where she has the flexibility to take care of her son Harry. One late evening after finishing a long project, Gary returned home exhausted. It was getting dark, and he wanted to get home early to spend time with his son. Gary was on his way home with his wife and son when he noticed something unusual in front of the house. An unfamiliar car had just started its engine, as if it was about to leave. Gary couldn't identify the owner, but the incident made him feel that something was wrong. He stood for a moment watching the car leave the quiet street, and doubts began to creep into his mind. He wondered who could be coming home at this hour. When he entered the house, Annie was just coming out of the kitchen, looking calm as if nothing special had happened. She turned to look at him with a tired smile, but her appearance didn't. Gary said he could sense something strange. He was still suspicious and asked who had just left. Gary had seen a car start up and leave when he arrived. Eddie was momentarily embarrassed but quickly regained her composure. "No one," she said. "You must have seen wrongly." Gary didn't want to make a big deal out of it right away. He just nodded and let it go, but he started to have doubts in his mind that he couldn't shake off from that time on. Gary started to pay more attention to the little things in family life. He gradually realized that Annie was more distant, not spending as much time with him and Harry as before. It was another late night when he got closer to his. Gary suddenly saw a man walking down the stairs in front of his house. The man looked confused and worried when he saw Gary. Gary stopped immediately, his heart pounding. Who was the strange man? Why was he there at this hour? Gary couldn't ignore his suspicions. He stepped forward and blocked the man's path. "Hello," he said. Gary said, trying to keep his voice calm. "What are you doing here?" The man stopped, a look of panic on his face. He was flustered, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for a way out of the situation. His voice trembled as he said, "Oh no, nothing. I just stopped by, but it's not important. I have to go now." The man quickly turned around and walked briskly towards the nearby car park. Gary stood there watching him in silence, but his mind was filled with questions as he entered the house. He tried to stay calm, but doubts kept swirling in his mind. He decided to ask directly. His voice was normal, but he could not hide his unease. Gary asked, his eyes not leaving her to observe her reaction. "Oh, that's the neighbor," she replied, her tone a bit cold and decisive. "He stopped by our house to play, but no one was home, so he went back." Yuri stood silently for a moment, pondering Annie's explanation. Something didn't add up. If it was just a neighbor visiting, why was the man so panicked and in such a hurry to leave? Why did his voice tremble when he answered? And why did anyone seem so indifferent and unnatural? Please support me by liking and subscribing. Although doubts continued to swirl in his mind, Gary knew he couldn't push the issue to a climax. He understood that making a fuss without concrete evidence would only make things more complicated. So he kept a calm exterior and decided not to ask any more questions from then on. Gary began to pay closer attention to everything around him. He observed. Annie's behavior was also a cause for concern. He decided to install a hidden mini camera in the bedroom, where he thought his suspicions might be taking place. Gary used a short time to install a tiny camera in a hidden corner of his bedroom, ensuring it wouldn't be detected. He set the device up to connect directly to his phone, allowing him to monitor everything in real time without having to be physically present in the house. When he was done, Gary looked around the room again, feeling both nervous and relieved. He knew it wouldn't be easy and that what he found would probably hurt more than he could imagine. He couldn't go on like this. He needed to know the truth. Gary went about his usual routine, giving no indication that he was being watched. He continued to go to work, chatting with Annie as if everything was fine. Late one evening, as Gary was driving home after a long day at work, his phone suddenly vibrated. With a notification, it was the signal from the mini camera he'd installed in his bedroom. He felt a rush of anxiety as he opened his phone to look at the image on the screen. In the frame, a strange man walked into the bedroom and sat close to Annie. Together on the bed, they chatted comfortably. The other man, whom Innie had never seen before, hugged and began to cuddle her. He gently pushed her onto the bed, and in the dim light of the room, slowly took off her clothes. Edie did not resist. She was completely immersed in that moment, as if forgetting everything around her. He put his hand was on Annie's private part, rubbing it gently to make her feel comfortable. She didn't resist. Gary was heartbroken and confused. He couldn't bear to see his wife betraying him like this. He couldn't take his eyes off the phone screen, where he could see the image of Annie and the other man in an intimate moment. All at once, Gary felt a rush of pain, anger, and betrayal. He quickly recorded the video from the secret camera, so he'd have evidence of Annie's betrayal. After recording the video, Gary turned off the phone and sat quietly in the car, feeling every pain seep deep into his heart. Gary knew that there was no going back from this. When he got home, the strange man had disappeared, leaving behind an unusual silence. Gary decided not to show his emotions immediately. He tried to stay calm, hiding the pain and anger in his heart. He walked into the living room, and he sat down on the sofa. His voice was calm but full of meaning. "Get me a glass of water, please." Annie went into the kitchen and brought him a glass of water as usual. She put the glass of water on the table and turned to leave. But Gary called her back with a slightly firmer voice. "Sit down. I have something to say." Annie paused, feeling a little embarrassed by Gary's strange tone. She slowly sat down next to him on the sofa, her eyes questioning but still keeping her calm. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to act natural. Gary sat silently for a moment, looking straight into Annie's eyes. The image from the camera flashed clearly in his mind, and he knew that this was the moment to face the truth. His heart was heavy, but his eyes were determined. The camera flashed in his mind, and he knew it was time to face the truth. His heart was heavy, but his eyes were determined. "I want us to watch a movie together," he said in a calm, even voice. "It's a sex movie." Eddie looked at him in surprise, frowning and asking, "What's wrong with you? Why? Are you suddenly talking so strangely, Gary?" He paused for a moment, looking at the glass of water in his hand, then looked straight at his eyes, which were no longer as warm as before. "No, I haven't finished," he continued, his voice strangely calm. "In this movie, you were the main character." She suddenly froze, her eyes wide, her body she was frozen, and didn't say another word when Gary turned on the video. The screen clearly showed Annie and the other man cuddling and having sex on the bed. She was stunned, her face pale and her hands shaking as she saw the scene. Her heart was pounding, and panic and guilt were evident on her face. She looked at Gary, tears welling up in her eyes, her voice choked. You. I don't want to watch anymore. I don't know. Annie lowered her head, unable to speak. "Why did you do this to me?" Gary's voice was low, but the hurt was obvious. "You destroyed everything. The past 10 years, everything we built together. It's all gone now. There's nothing to save." Her face covered in tears, she trembled slightly as Gary's words pierced her heart. She started crying, and her tears echoed as if she couldn't find the words to express her regret. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I was wrong. Please forgive me. I regret it. I really regret it." Gary shook his head and looked away. "Do you think I can forget everything and go back to the way things were? How could she forgive him when she looked at him every time?" She tried to justify herself, her hands shaking as she wiped away her tears, trying to salvage the situation. But Gary, with his cold and determined eyes, no longer wanted to hear any more explanations. He raised his hand, cutting her off. Her voice was firm and decisive. "That's enough. I don't want to hear anything more from you." Eddie was silent. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Gary. She knew that no words could change anything. She had betrayed him and broken all the trust they had. "Pack up your things and leave." "I don't want to." "See you again," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. She couldn't believe things had gotten this bad. She couldn't help but sob as she looked at Gary, the man she had loved and lived with for the past 10 years. He was standing in front of her with a cold and determined gaze. She tried to say something. She wanted to explain or apologize, but Gary wasn't having it. Her betrayal was obvious, and any attempt to mend things now was useless. She had 10 minutes to pack her things and leave before he changed his mind. Edie knew this wasn't the time to confront Gary. She could see the She could see the anger in his eyes and knew that no amount of explanation or apology would make up for the pain she had caused. Gary, the man she had loved and trusted, was now looking at her with cold eyes devoid of any affection. Instead of trying to hold on or confront him at this moment, he decided to leave. She bowed her head. Edie walked slowly and quietly towards the door, each step seeming to be weighed down by fear and regret. She knew that this was the only way to avoid making the situation worse. She took one last look at the house, which once held so many memories between her and Gary, but now everything had changed. Deep down, she still held out hope that one day she could get back together with Gary. She hoped that when her anger subsided, he would understand and forgive her. But right now, she knew she had to leave to avoid further hurt. She walked away, leaving everything behind, carrying with her regret and anxiety about the future.